Have you ever taken a photo and don't understand why it's too dark or too light? Well, we're going to solve that issue for you today with understanding the exposure triangle. What's up? This is John from John Rents for Photography, and I'm a wedding photographer and Fujifilm X photographer. I've been doing photography professionally now for 7 years, and I want to help you understand how to shoot in manual. So today, let's take a quick look at the exposure triangle and how to understand light. So the exposure triangle are 3 settings on your camera that will help you get a correct exposure. You have ISO, or your camera's sensitivity, your shutter speed, and also your aperture, or you can also call it your f-stop. Each of these settings are going to get you to a correct exposure. But what's most important about the exposure triangle is understanding what each of these settings do to your photos. And this is actually why I don't show any of my settings on my photos. You may have noticed that if you've seen any of my other videos, but basically, in my opinion, showing my settings will not help you learn how to get a correct exposure. But what I'm about to teach you now will. So let's talk about each of those settings and what attributes they add to your photos. Starting out with the shutter speed. Your shutter speed is essentially how fast the shutter is opening and closing to let light into your camera. So when your shutter is very low, it lets in more light, and when it's very high, it lets in less light. The attributes that come along with your shutter speed is that if your shutter is low, if anyone happens to be moving in your photo, you get motion blur, kind of like this. But if your shutter speed is very high, then you get no motion blur at all. It actually stops all motion. So shutter speed low, motion blur, shutter speed high, stop motion. Next up, we have our aperture. Your aperture works kind of like the iris on your eye. When it's wide open, it lets in more light, and when it's stopped down, it lets in less light. The attribute that goes along with this is while it's wide open, you get more of a blurry background or depth of field. And when your aperture is high or you're stopped down, then everything is in focus. Here's an example of a photo wide open. As you can see, there's some blurry background on it. And then here's a photo with the aperture stopped down. You can see most everything in the photo is in focus. Even though our exposures are pretty much the same here, you can see it gives a very different result. So low aperture equals blurry backgrounds, high aperture equals sharp photos all the way through. And last but not least is the ISO. ISO is basically your camera's sensitivity to the light. The lower the ISO is, the less light it takes in, and the higher the ISO is, the more light it takes in. The attribute that goes along with ISO is grain. So when your ISO is low, your photos are cleaner and crisper, and there's less noise and grain in the photo. Whereas if your ISO is very high, you're going to get very grainy, muddy photos. Here's an example of low ISO, and then here's a photo with high ISO. Just check out all the digital noise on the photo on the right. So basically the way the exposure triangle works is you're balancing all 3 of these settings at the same time to figure out how you want to light your photo. But again, the main thing you have to keep in mind are the attributes they bring along with the photo. So now that we understand our settings and what they're doing, let me give you an example of how I like to find the light when I first enter a space. When thinking about my lighting, the first thing I always do is set my ISO. ISO is a setting that you don't want to change around too much. I think of it as my foundation or base setting. So I walk into the room, I like the way it looks, maybe it's a little dark, so I raise my ISO just a bit. Generally, as best practice, choose a limit for your ISO. Don't just crank it all the way up because your camera can. For instance, on my Fuji X-T3s, I don't really like to go too far over 2000 ISO. So once I set my base ISO, then I start thinking about my other settings. Now, generally with aperture, we're going to be choosing that based off of the style of the photos. As a wedding photographer, I love to shoot wide open as much as I can. So I don't really need to think about that setting. The only time I'm ever really changing my ISO is if I need to stop down to get photos sharper. This is typically done if I'm doing group photos or something of that sort. And now that my aperture is wide open or a low f-stop, then I start thinking about my shutter speed. Again, since I take photos of people and people are always moving, I want my shutter speed at least around 1/160. This way I won't get too much motion blur. But generally for the most part, I'll crank my shutter speed as high as it needs to go based on the lighting of the room. Again, the attribute of the shutter speed doesn't really affect your photos as much as ISO and aperture will. And that's why I handle choosing my exposure based on ISO as the base aperture based on how I want to stylistically shoot, and then shutter speed to make sure I have enough light. Also keep in mind that for every setting that's changed, you have to compensate with another setting to get your correct exposure. So for instance, if my ISO is very low, then I might need to lower my shutter speed or lower my aperture to get a correct exposure. Or if my shutter speed is very high and it's too dark, then I'll need to raise my ISO or lower my aperture. Or if my aperture is very high, I might need to lower my shutter and raise my ISO. Basically, each of these settings need to be balanced for the correct exposure. So if you haven't done this before, definitely get your camera out now, turn it on manual mode, look at the room, choose your ISO, maybe somewhere around 400 or 500 in a darker room, figure out where you want your aperture to be. Again, stylistically, I tend to leave it wide open, but remember that can make it hard to focus sometimes. And then figure out where your shutter needs to be so that your photo's not too bright or too dark. And after you've done all that, you should have a great exposure. I hope this first look at the exposure triangle was helpful for you all, and make sure to hit that like and subscribe to the channel because I'm gonna actually take you out on a real session and show you how I do exposure actually on site. So again, if you want to see more of this and understand it in action, make sure to subscribe for more. Thanks again for hanging out on the channel, and I hope that was helpful. I'll catch you all next time.